G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series, learning from other people's mistakes, or learning from grandmaster mistakes, kind of the same thing, where I look at the mistakes which much stronger players have made in endgames, usually under time pressure, and try and learn from that. It really sharpens your endgame understanding, sort of knowing what mistakes to try and avoid and improve your endgame technique. Okay, so I've done pawn endgames earlier, and also in this series I've done some specific endgames where particular players, such as I think I did one for Ruja, makes an endgame mistake and been able to sort of learn a lot from seeing the errors that have been made. This time around I'm doing the biggie, learning from mistakes in Rook endgames. There's obviously a lot of theory around Rook endgames, which actually kind of helps. And I'm actually, in this video, I'm just going to look at the simplest of endgames. It's going to be Rook and Pawn versus Rook. Now, it might be simple, but there's a lot of ways to go wrong, and we'll sort of go through what common things do go wrong. Now, so there'll be 3 bits to this video, quite a bit to get through. First of all, I'll just outline the analysis I've done. Basically the same I did with Pawn endgames, but just a good reminder of the sort of different tools, Scout, Fish, Table Bases, Python Chess, and so on, which I've been using. The second bit will be Rook endgame is kind of unique. There is a lot of standard rules which actually help to frame the analysis of the endgame. You know, you can sort of actually say if you do this, you've broken that rule. If you do this, you're following that rule, that sort of stuff. So I'm going to go through a set of rules, basically taking it from Matthew Sadler's blog. I'll sort of refer to that as we go along. Of course, I have quite a few Rook endgame books around here as well, and they all kind of sort of focus on the same sorts of things, you know, like short side defense, Sharon's frontal defense, passive defense on the back rank, all those sorts of things. So we'll cover those so that when we then do the meat of today's episode, which is the Rook endgames by strong players, and I've got a bunch of them where they've made errors, we'll be able to say, okay, he missed the short side defense in this position, that sort of thing. It actually help us sort of play these positions in our own game. So that's where we're headed today. So buckle down, and first of all, let's go through the technique I've used for doing the analysis. Process chart here in Excel, just to get an idea. Okay, first of all, we need to start with the database. Now, this has varied a bit since I've started doing these videos. When I started off, Kesa database was still live and up, and that seems to be taken down, but the game's in Kesa, which actually, for my purposes, is perfect for this because it's sort of just historical. It's got a lot of all the strong games. Anyway, that sort of seemed to be subsumed by Lumbra and Heredris databases. They both have these games in them as well. I've stayed clear of like databases like Blitz, which probably has a lot more Blitz type stuff in it. So these are the ones I've been using. You can get them, Lumbra and Heredris, from just to download, and many games, and no issues there. So that's where we start. We've got a PGN database, and then I use Scout Fish to filter for the material. You can see what I've done there. I'll just quickly switch over to this capture screen. Okay, here's Scout Fish, and basically, if you look at the website there, GitHub and Costalba, who does it, Scout Fish. Here's the bit of code I basically be running all the time, and then what you're talking about is what your query is. What query you send in. So here's white move castle, and that's just sort of the pretty result. So basically you put material, and what I put in is king rook, and then one pawn on one side, and then one pawn on either side, and then 2 pawns for 0 pawns, and that's 6. So I'm going to go to 6-piece table base for these purposes. That's what Scoutfish does for us. We do the search and come back with a bunch of Rook games. Yeah. So once you've got them all together, let's go back. So we've got, you know, this might be, let's say Kesa base might be 5 million games. You filter it out. You know, 5% of them might be Rook end games of that type, maybe a little bit less. And then I also want to take out games by weaker players, right? So the way to do that is, Skid versus PC has a sort of dictionary, and that basically is a storage of the ratings of the players at different dates in time. And you use that to sort of, you cross-reference that to the game, and then basically you can say, oh, okay, well, I only want games where both players are greater than 2,500. So you can use Skid versus PC to help you with that. This is important because it's a picture of that. I really want to include the older players because a lot of these blunders in Rook endgames are really interesting because maybe the turn of the 20th century, these great players, maybe the theory hadn't been quite worked out, and you see them make some errors which nowadays people would not tend to make. Okay, so that's that. So we've sort of got this big database, filter for Rook endgames filter for grandmasters, and now we do the find mistakes. So this is, I've explained in earlier videos. This time I'm using Python Chess. Now bring up Python Chess for a second here. And Python Chess has a script like this, which lets you go through a game. Import chess.pgn is the package which lets you go through PGNs, and you get the first game, and then you go through move by move, right? So if you script like that, you can then you have a list of games, and you go through all the games, and you go through all the moves, and then what you're missing here, I've seen the other, I've shown it in previous videos, is that you put another line in here which says send this position to the table base, what should the theoretical result be? Now because I've restricted it to less than 6 pieces, then it will always be, it'll be a win or a draw or a loss, as it were, right? And then to find errors, you find a game which was, for instance, won by white, and then white plays a move, and now it's not won by white. It could be a draw, right? And vice versa. So basically, you're looking for any change in the theoretical outcome of the game caused by a move, and you look at that guy's move, and then, okay, he made a mistake. So that's the premise. We're using Python Chess plus the Syzygy table bases to go through the games. And so that's effectively another filter, and I come back with a few hundred games where there are mistakes, come in the number, so that's all good. And what I do is get 2 files from that. I get a file of draws to losses, which I think is the one we're going to look at most today. Draws to losses when you're a pawn down. So this is basically where you had a drawing technique and you failed to utilize it, and it even gets the best of them. I've got a game in there where a Carlsen, quite a famous game, a younger Carlsen loses against Aronian in a Rook endgame. He should have drawn, and I'll look at that file mainly today. And there may be another file I'll look at where people messed up on a win. Okay, and of course this is I just doing this because it's very thematic. I could do pawn endgames again, a bit more detail. I could do knight endgames or bishop endgames. Okay, so now that's the approach. So now what we're going to do is, because Rook endgames, as I say, have that unique feature. There's like a set of rules which are actually really useful for breaking down the position and being able to analyze it a little bit more simply. Oh, that's a win. Knight endgame, bishop endgames don't have the same sort of set of rules which make it easy to understand the position straight away. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to sort of go through this set of rules. I said I got them from the Matthew Sadler website. Go through the set of rules which we're going to sort of draw on. Not all of them, going to draw on them. So when we're actually looking at the games where a player lost a drawn position, we'll say, what in simple terms, what went wrong. So we'll do that next bit. So that's clear. So sorry, it's been a very long introduction, but I just want to understand this is sort of these are all open source tools. I've done other videos on how to use them. So it's basically using these open source tools to look in detail at something which I wanted to look at. And I think it's my Rook endgames definitely got a lot sharper having looked at this, because I've sort of got the rules down pat. And I can see the sort of things to look out for when you are in Rook endgames. And Rook endgames are the most common ones, so you should be comfortable playing them and also at speed. Okay, so let me switch over to the Ubuntu capture screen. Okay, that's Python Chess, we looked at that. That's Scoutfish, we looked at that. So now what I'm going to draw on, see here's long side, short side. You should understand this concept. We talk about that a lot in Rook endgames. You see this heading here, King, Rook, and Pawn vs. King and Rook Part 1 by Matthew Sadler. It is like 10 years old, right? And he's got 3, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 on his blog. So definitely go and have a look at that. I've just summarized what he's done in Part 1 and Part 2 and Part 3. He's come up with a set of, let's have a look underneath, 16 rules he's come up with. So we'll just briefly go over some of those rules, not all of them, so that when we're looking at the blunders people made, we'll have a much better understanding of what's going on. So this is a great blog by Matthew Sadler. You should you just flick through. He explains the different things. So Lucena position, because I'm not going to do Lucena position, but Lucena position is the one when you're defending you want to avoid at all costs, right? So remember, Black's king is cut off from the white pawn, and White gets his king in front of the pawn, and then he brings his rook back and builds a bridge in inverted commas. Just close that, and now let's have a quick look at the rules. We're going to have a quick look at the rules, and then I've done some visualization of each of those rules. So just have a look at that. I've got a list of them. Philidors, passive defense, short side, short side pawn on the 5th, long side pawn on the 5th, short side pawn on the 6th, Chiron's B pawn frontal attack, and Vancouver position. So we're just going to cover those 7 rules, which are a subset of these rules, which we're just going to read through now. And if you're comfortable with all those rules, then by all means skip to where we start looking at the blunders by grandmasters later on in the video. These Matthew Sadler rules. So it's not interfering. Okay, so I'm going to leave that up, just the Word document, as a bit of an aid memoir, right? So let's have a look. Rule number 1. Pawn, a knight pawn on the 5th, supported by the white king, and then the simple rule, black has the defending side, we'll just take that as a given, must get the king in front of the pawn, because all the other defenses just don't work. Now, if you've got a bishop pawn supported by the king on the 5th, king must be able to escape to the short side. This is where passive defense sitting in front doesn't work, and short side defense. You saw that diagram earlier. Basically, the whole idea is the king runs the short side, and the rook can check from the long side. Now, if it's a central pawn, rule 3, then either short side or long side defense will work. Just as I was going through this, of course, I've taken this from Matthew Sadler. I mean, very strong English grandmaster. Actually, he's got a very good YouTube channel, Silicon Road, all into computer chess and that sort of stuff. I've actually got his book on Queen's Gambit, so very strong player of the Queen's Gambit. And of course, these rules or comparable rules in various book endgame books, but anyway, just a good summary. So that's why I'm sort of going through it sort of ad nauseum. And then rule 4, just go to the short side, as said, so you can check from the long side. Now, the more critical positions, a knight's pawn on the 6th. The king can sit in front of the pawn with the rook on the back rank, and actually that is defensible. If it's bishop pawn or a central pawn, then you can't allow that. You either have philidors, where you're checking from behind, or the old sort of short side defense, right? You can see sort of going through short side defense. All positions maintain maximum checking distance. That's obviously relevant. Sometimes you want to be in the A file rather than the B file to give more sort of checking distance. Right, so now we go to the frontal defenses. A knight's pawn on the 4th, supported by a king, and then you have Chiron position, which we've looked at before, where there's a very particular position that the defending king needs to be on. Okay, don't let your king get cut off along a rank. This half cut, full cut. I think that's where I'll wrap it up for those descriptions. Okay, and then you've got the specific rook pawns positions down the bottom, and we've done Vancouver, right? So if it's a pawn on the 7th with the rook in front of it, then the black king's got to be hiding off to the side, and then if it's on the 6th rank, then you've got to get your rook to f6. When they do the diagram and check from the side as appropriate. Vancouver, I've done a quick video on that, so that's sort of the things to think about. Okay, so that is the listing of the rules. Now, what I've done here is that I've got this file with those 7 positions where I've just tried to highlight what is going on. Let's go through these one by one. So there's no moves. I've just set up the board and then done some visualizations, which certainly, the real important aid de memoire, if you try and visualize things as you're studying them, and then during the game maybe you'll remember them a little bit more easily. You see the blue arrow on the 6th rank, so the rook is cutting the 6th rank, the defending rook is cutting the 6th rank, so that the white king could not advance. The only way for white to make progress is, you can see highlighted, move 1, which we're pushing the pawn to d6, and that's when the black rook swings to the back, goes to h1. And then if the white king advances to e6, you just swing across the first rank, and you're checking wherever the white king goes. You check it continually, and you check it away long enough, and then you go back to d1 and attack the pawn, and white will not be able to make any progress, even though his pawn would, in that situation, it's on the 6th rank, but there's no cover from the checks. So that's the basic philidor position and the basic way of drawing. Now what's going to happen is, if a GM gets to a philidor position, of course they're drawing, but what will often, a move or two before they get to it, they'll make a little bit of an error and they won't get into the philidor's position, and that will then make all the difference. Okay, so let's look at the second position we're looking at. So this is passive. So remember, it was very important with the knight's pawn that the king's got to get in front. Once king's in front, it just sits like that. That looks like a very terrible position, actually. I didn't animate this one at all, right? But basically, no progress can be made. I think the important thing to remember is that if they put one move in here, rook b7 check, it doesn't really matter. But basically, if you went to c8 now and you got checked again, then you should go to b8. You shouldn't allow the rook space to check on a8 or in any circumstances if we was able to push the pawn and check on a8. So you just got to stay in the corner and have your rook covering the back rank. Okay, so that's passive defense with the knight's pawn. Let's go to the next one, and that is short side with this is a bishop pawn on the 5th. You're on the king's on the short side. Perfect, exactly what you want. And your rook is behind the pawn, restricting white's freedom to move. And so white can't make any progress here. what he has to do to make progress is, as I showed with the highlighted number there, the rook has to swing through f8 so that when the king moves, the pawn will be defended. Right, as soon as that rook does that, threatening to advance the white king, then you swing across to a1, maximum checking distance, and now wherever the white king goes, it will be checked and harassed until he could be pushed back to g5, for instance, but won't be able to make any progress. You can see that what might typically happen is it might be king goes to e7, and then you've got checks on, as I've sort of shown there with the red arrows, checks on over here, a7 and a6. Yeah, so rook across, our rook swings across, king moves up, check, 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 check. Eventually the king will go back. So that's the classic short side defense with the pawn on the 5th rank. Okay, that's a very comfortable way of drawing, but it wouldn't work if you're on the other side of the board because you wouldn't have the checking distance. Okay, let's move on one more. Okay, so here's long side defense. This is really important to know. This sometimes happens with central pawns. Long side defense with central pawns can work, but as Sadler points out in his blog, it requires very accurate defense. Okay, so same approach. Rook swings to e8. White king's threatening to advance, and then the pawn will follow. We swing across to the short side. It's not great. King moves to f7. We check it. King moves to g6. Looks all over, right? Rook's been driven off. Pawn's going to advance. But this is where the key move is king to d7, the unfortunate position of the white rook. So the white rook has to give up on the d file. What would happen? Rook would go back to a8. Our rook would go back to h1, h2. h1's probably best. And we're back where we started. That is the long side defense. Works only on central pawns where you have enough space. Okay, so this is short side defense, which works even on the 6th rank. We did the 5th rank before. Here's the 6th rank. Everything's sort of a bit weird here. But the point is that the extra aspect which Sadler mentions is you've got to keep the queen square under control with the rook. You see I've highlighted that. Rook has to sit on that square, covering the, in this case, e8 square. So let's have a look at how this defense works. I mean, the king has got to get out of the way, right? And the king can't move to the 8th rank. So the king, you can see the suggested move is king back to d6, threatening to advance the pawn. Okay, it doesn't show up because I can't do arrows both ways. That would have king f6. Okay, so if the pawn advances, so I think it's just rook to e8, and we're attacking the pawn twice, and it's going to drop, can't be held, right? So what happens is that we have brought our king up to f6. Now the king moves up to d7, threatening to advance the pawn. And actually, we just drop back. Let's move to, we just drop back to g7. Now the problem is if the pawn advances here, same problem. We'll just step across to f7, and then the pawn's going to drop because we control the queen square. I think that's the key the whole time along here, right? Is that we're controlling the queen square, so that the white rook can't control the queen square. Now it's very interesting that there is a game with Carlsen where he loses a very similar position to this. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So that what then happens is, okay, the king goes back to starting square. We go to g6. Something to remember, you go to g6, that's the right square, and then let's say white tries to activate his rook, b1, then we just have checks from the side, and then as the white king comes across, you can just drop back and cover. So I think the thing is there that the short side defense is something you really have to be ready to take. So that's why that gets quite a bit of focus in this. Okay, here's the Chiron position, which we've covered in another video. It's checking from the front. You need your king to be very close to the e5 square. So you can look at what happens. If the king zigzags up, this is zigzagging as the black rook is checking. You get to this square, a6 in this case, and actually you just go back and attack the pawn. And then either white has to back off, because if the white rook comes up to d4, then this is where we have the move. We attack the rook drops back, actually the pawn gets taken, and if the rook goes to the side, then the black king can get in front of the pawn, and that'll be a draw, probably in front of the pawn, and then either do a fillet or get across to the short side. So the problem is that he was cut off in the opening position, but he can use this technique, Chiron's defense, to either win the pawn or get the king in front of the pawn, both help to draw. And then the last generic position, which we're going to look at before we move on to actual games, is this one. Vancouver did a whole video about that, and the whole thing is that whilst this square is here on the 7th rank for the king to hide. Checks from the back won't work. So basically the ideal position is the rook here on f6, checking from the side, attacking the pawn for starters, checking from the side if the white king approaches, and if the pawn ever gets pushed, then we're in the safe position. So we'll then swing down the first rank and check from there. And this is a very sort of kind of special drawing technique, Vancouver position. So there we go. The 7 positions which we're going to see people kind of repeatedly miss in these blunders, and trying to give you a better understanding of what's going on and what we should do in our own games. Right. So now what I'm going to load up is that was the theory ones. Let me see if I can find rook errors. So I've got another database. Basically, I mean, Skid's so good. You just have a PGN file, create a new database of what you want to look at, load all the games in, and you can see there's 220 games. Now, luckily for you, we're not going to go 220 games. I'll tell you how the way it's broken up is these earlier ones from the filter were where you can see rook 1, rook 1, rook 2, rook 2. So these have more pawns on the position, and we just want to go to the simplest ones. And in fact, a game will actually end up in this PGN twice, because if it was a rook and 2 pawns and then it became rook and 1 pawn, then it'll be in there twice. I'm only looking for the errors in the rook and 1 pawn games. And just have a look. I've got the first game I want to look at is one by Gligoric-Guimard, which is this one here from 1953, Mar del Plata. Funnily enough, I got 2 games, both by Guimard, in the same tournament. So that's interesting. Now we use the other piece of software, which is an amazing tool. I used Stockfish, so Stockfish would quickly identify all the lines. Obviously, table-based would as well, so we can see what's going on, and it'll suggest best lines and so on. You can use other chess engines as well, but obviously Stockfish, it's open source. I've shown you how to build it in Linux VirtualBox, and it's a great friend for positions like this. But to be honest, I think the best thing to do is to analyze them yourself first, see if you can understand what's going on. So this position itself is quite strange. This is a winning white position. Gligoric playing white. I don't know, maybe he's quite young. What he has to do is get his king around to the king side and support the pawns, and it's just bishop pawn, knight pawn, quite an easy win. However, what he did do, he just played g6, which lost a pawn. Now obviously he assumed this position was winning. If we look at the framework here, we can see that black king is in the right spot. It's on the short side. Yeah, so we move forwards. Yeah, so this is the key position. He needs to keep an eye on the f pawn with the king, and the rook stops it from advancing. If he pushes it with check, we just move to g7 and it'll drop the next move. So just hold station. Okay, so let's have a look. He didn't play that. King to h7. So I say rook f3. Actually, let's go to the drawing line first, so we understand. I want to understand the techniques here. Rook f3. White can try to win by checking the black king. That's a bit nasty. I can't take the pawn, obviously, because that'd be pretty bad. So now we switch over to the long side defense, right? See, the position we actually want. We're going to be able to check from the side. Check. I mean, what's white can do? And now king back, hassle the pawn. Right, so it's a combination of hassling the pawn from the 6th rank. Once again, the pawn can't be advanced because we'll check from the side and win the pawn. So let's have a look. Try it that way, push the pawn. You're never going to escape the checks. If the king comes too far across, we'll stop the pawn from queening, and the pawn will drop. Right, so that's sort of the basis of the long side defense or short side defense. Rook on the long side, king on the short side. So he had that set up. Problem was king h7 is not keeping pressure on the pawn when it is required. Let's have a look at the game continuation. So now it's winning, right? Now, I said I wasn't going to do Lucina position. Now we have Lucina's position, or Lucina, I haven't even pronounced it. This is a winning position. I'm not sure how much longer they go for. Now it's even easier, because it's just gonna because the rook position is even quicker victory. You can see there was not really a missed short side defense. Short side defense was played wrongly by Guimard, and then white was able to set up what I consider a Lucina position. Right, so there's the first thing. Always remember with short side defense, it's really important to think about where your king is. Normally it should be pressuring the pawn, or able to pressure the pawn. at least one of the rook and the king should be pressuring the pawn. Okay, so that is the first game, right? And then the next game we're going to look at is actually the next one on the list. It's Najdorf versus Guimard. Okay, so let's have a look at what sort of position we've got here. And you can see this looks a lot like the Vancouver position. There is the space in front of the pawns all the way up. Obviously, sort of the rook defending from the back rank is not going to work. So we want to try and set up a Vancouver position, which Black did not do. Black played rook to c2, which is not losing yet. I mean, there's still plenty of time to set up the Vancouver position, but he never did. And he just continued playing, not doing Vancouver. Right, but what about getting into the Vancouver position? Rook check, king up, rook to the bishop file, which is what we want. And now check, check, check. I mean, what's white going to do? White moves forward. So we can't move forward to this position because we lose the rook. But let's assume that's sort of not the case. Let's say the king comes back to some square like that. Then, in fact, this is sort of a different type of Vancouver, isn't it, right? Because what's going to happen is that the rook will move up, and the pawn will gradually move up. I should have done those colouring, and then, but at the same time, we will move our king and our rook up to the required positions, and that will be a draw. Yeah, so that's kind of the way of thinking about it, because we'll cover from the side. The white king's always cut off at the back, and if the white king ever tries to go over that side, well, then we just start checking. Yeah, so that's a missed Vancouver. So Guimard, unfortunately, he picked on him twice. Obviously a strong player, otherwise they wouldn't be in this filtered list of games I've come up with, right? So missed Vancouver. Okay, so let's keep going. The next game I want to look at is, as you'll notice, they're always good players. Reshevsky versus Najdorf. Let's have a look at that one. You can see it's the games I put the notes on. Okay, we'll go to like a move before the position. And okay, so you want your king to get to the short side. And it's really funny what happens here. Just think about it. Just look at this position. You want your king to get to the short side. Well, it's not Brooks. It's not cut off. What are you going to do? Right? And actually, there's two moves. One draws and one loses. Because the thing is, Najdorf played king e8. He doesn't get to the short side now. Because after king f6, you can't go to the short side. Because the checkmate. It's just terrible. So now he's just can't do anything. Check. Check. And now we've set up ideal position. We're going to get a Lucina. And Black resigned. So what's the difference? What's the difference with king e7? You'd think actually it just makes so much sense. Just run across like that. But this is shouldering. Gets you to the short side. Yeah. So you play king e7. You rook check. King f8. King f6. King g8. You've got the short side. Your rook might hang out there. And depending on the situation, it'll go over there. Over there. And check from the sides. Much as you want. That's what you're looking for. Right, so just a tiny error. Didn't shoulder the white king. The white king's threat of mate king f6. Black couldn't get to the short side. Right, that was a bit of a disaster for Najdorf. Okay, so that's quite interesting, right? Always it just shows you the importance of getting the short side. It's a win versus a loss. Okay, so let's have a look. What's the next game we're looking for? Taimanov-Larsen. Let's have a look at Taimanov-Larsen. Okay, h check. King there, decision's drawn, check, king back. Many moves draw here, except that move. Okay, so let's investigate what is wrong with king e5. Let's have a look at the position. Okay, if you had a look, it's all about this cut-off problem. Yeah, so he's played king to, now gets cut. And let's see what the continuation is. King comes back, check, and then that's quite disastrous. Not going to hold that position while you get Lucina advance the pawn. So the king gets cut off. Right, so what was different about this position? All the other moves are drawing. Yeah, for instance, like king f4 is obviously another move to think about. Yeah, this is unusual tactics. There's no way. White can keep checking. If advances the pawn, see what happens? Actually checkmate. So that was actually, this is not a thematic one. There was this tactic which you had to see. Okay, that was quite interesting. It would have been just a simple oversight by Larsen. Next game, I'm going to look at Timman-Marjanovic. Just build a position, king. Okay, right. So there's a few possibilities here. It's a rook pawn, and the black king is quite close. it looks like you should be able to draw this position. And you can see, I think all those lines I've indicated, just getting the rook out of the way, doing some checking, even going all the way over to a7 and then checking from the side, should be sufficient. Could possibly turn into a Vancouver position, but it's black's king position not ideal. Anyway, so what happened is he played king e7, and now suddenly the tactics just don't work. It's like a skewer. We've got to look out for a skewer. That often happens when the pawn is on the 7th rank, but even so, that's a deadly skewer, right? Because now just the tactics work against black. I mean, what's black going to do now? The rook has no squares. King moves. Then you get skewered again, or the white king can move in and push the rook away. So, and play the pawn. So that was more of a tactics thing. That wasn't a thematic one, but it was a bit unfortunate what happened to the black player. Okay, now we've got another game here. Ehlvest-Ljubojevic position, rook e5. Okay, once again, it's you need to get the short side, right? That rook move was wasted move, right? That's the whole problem. Yeah, so we'll go through that. We'll go through the drawing line. King f6, hassle that rook. So can't exchange rooks because white will have an extra tempo. The rook runs away, and then now the white king, for the white king to get across, obviously needs to get across. Rooks have to be exchanged, and now that will be a draw. Now the funny thing is that so when he played this rook to c4 move, changed the dynamics. Now the white king gets across. White king gets across, whereas the black king is blocked and doesn't have the tempos to get across. And then this will be a winning position, something like that. Well, to get to Lucino position eventually, right? So this goes back to this first move. Should have been trying to get the king across, and the best way of doing that was king f6, right? And you would get your king in front of the pawn. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Grischuk versus Gurevich. Look at what the position looked like. Okay, so black king's cut off, but on the short side, and once again, the correct move is helping to get your king out first, because king g6 didn't help. King g4 didn't help. Now the pawn just gets pushed, and that's it. The game over already. Right? But if we go back to this position and rook check first, let's see how that works better. I mean, the king goes back, you're not making any progress, right? So king's got to advance. Take the pawn. Pawn's got to be pushed. And then now the king gets up. Oh, that's so tricky because now you've got short side defense set up. Rook's in perfect position. Right, so you need to use those tactics to get to the short side defense. I mean, think about it. Say it's not so much knowing the short side defense or not. It's do you know how to get it in some slightly tricky position? Okay, we've got another Motylev-Shirov. Okay, so this position's drawn, and what should he play? All right, so this is where one of the tactics to get your king in front of the pawn. Right, so he played rook c6, which is a bit of a nothing move. And then his king's cut off, and he's going to be a Lucino position. Okay, king's on the wrong side. Yeah, king's on the long side, rook's on the short side. No checking distance. So let's have a look at this maneuver, which you see a lot to get the king across. First of all, rook c8, check, check, and that move there is the killer because if rooks get exchanged, let's do that, then black will have the opposition because he's got this square here he can hide on, and as soon as white moves up, black will move up and take the position, and the king position is a draw. Okay, so once again, using this rook to the back rank and rook across challenging the other rook is a standard tactic you see quite a bit to get your king into the right position. Okay, next game we're going to look at is the interesting one. This is the classic one. Carlsen versus, well, Aronian versus Carlsen, holding the pawn, king's on the short side. What's not to like? This should be a draw. Draws are what he played, or also just holding behind the e-pawn. So he goes for this other sort of short side defense we'd seen before. King up, attack the pawn, check, And now, this is what we said, you're covering the queening square, and now the drawing line is not what he played, because what he played gave up the queening square. So you can see that the drawing line is, well, the losing line is a rook a7 check. Now it's king to e8, followed by rook to d8, and then push the pawn, and well, eventually push the pawn. Can't do much. Push the pawn, can't do much. Maybe swing back here. Check. Check. And now you can see the problem is that we can cover the checks from the side. Yeah, so that would have been losing. What he should have done is just kept the king active. Let's go through that line, sorry. King g6. Now, logical thing is to try and take the queening square, but this is where the checks come in, and you either back off and just draw checks, or you get in the way again, and we're back to where we were. And if you push the pawn, then we can just step over it and attack it a second time, and that will be a draw. Okay, so this was sort of a misplayed short side defense by Carlsen. So that was a bit unusual. Let's have a look at another one here. Sasikiran versus Aronian. And this is, I've noted this down as a Chiron defense. Let's have a look. Yeah, it looks like Chiron defense. And then the move played loses, right? Remember that defensive technique earlier? You just sit on d5. And then the thing is that even if the pawn advances to the fourth rank, you're just going to check, and then the king's going to be close enough to cause a hassle for the rook. Yeah, but that's not what happened. So let's have a look at Sokolov-Banikas. I've got something about passive defense here. Okay, so the problem here is that you're a short side defense, right? King g7, king f6, depending on what's going on. Short side defense. If he tries to advance up, you're covering the queening square, Oh, good, exactly. This is the Carlsen position once again. But for whatever reason, that's black was trying passive defense. Now, passive defense does not work. There's different reasons why it doesn't work. But what's going to happen here is it's going to be a deadly check there, and if the rook runs back along, then it's check, and then it's going to be a check with the pawn, and that is all over. So passive defense only works with knight pawns. That's one thing you got to remember. Maybe put another game here by Nigel Short. So look what we've got in this one. Okay, I've written down Mr. Vancouver here. Okay, takes that. Oh, it's the Vancouver position. It's you know, as you can see there, you should go rook to f5, and then you've got the Vancouver already set up, but he moved the king instead, and then now it's not losing yet, but the player's not trying. Now it's losing. The player's not trying to get the Vancouver position. It's just going to be a win. King will head up to b7. King will to b8. So I think the thing is, if you go back to this position here, when you see the rook pawn like this with space in front of it, just position your rook on the f file and get your king in the corner here, there or there. And that is Vancouver. So always think of Vancouver transitions. Okay, we've got another one with Magnus Carlsen. Magnus Carlsen versus Hein-Peter Nielsen. And what we're looking at this time is, oh, this looks like a decent short side position. Yeah, should be drawing. And position there is perfect. Right, you should just move the rook. What happens with that? It's just a tactical mistake, I think, because wait a minute, let's do game continuation. Check. And now the king's cut off. It's one of these cut off things where the king's cut off, and it's just not good. King's cut off in a bad way. Okay, so that wins. Now, what should he have done? Just hold station. Okay, h2, sorry. Now with the king advancing, you got a perfect short side defense. King's in a good spot, and the rook's going to come up here. I'm going to check. Yep. So that was short side, but you have to be aware of these rules about it. Your king gets cut off behind the pawn, and sometimes it's... Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Nakamura-Wesley. Let's see what went wrong here. Both strong players. This is just a tactical oversight. Rook b8 now wins. Yeah, right, that was a tactical oversight. That didn't really... this Spielmann-Duras one I want to look at. It's quite funny. The 5 check. Position looks very drawn. Just drop back with the king. And what I'm going to overlook is Duras can just advance his king. And then now, if rooks are exchanged, then black has the opposition and will win. This could go on and on. I'm just going to look at one more. Kochyev-Smyslov. The Smyslov, I believe. Yeah, 1978, later in his career. And this is a frontal defense one again, just to understand frontal defense. Right, okay, so remember we said you need your king here, you need king on e4, so that you can hassle the rook in some cases. But that's not what Kochyev played. Kochyev dropped his king back, and then now it's winning because we get to the same position. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could hassle that rook? But you can't hassle the rook. And now you've done this process, and white king is cut off, and the black king will be able to shift the pawn through. So that actually was a very good demonstration. Just get back the difference. This position here, one move wins, one move loses. Keep the king active in the frontal defense Chiron position. Okay, so there is actually about 10 other games we could look at on this list. Games, but I'm going to stop it there. So I think I've achieved my purpose. What I wanted to show was that in rook endgames, there's certain sort of patterns you look for, and we've seen a bunch of games there where people would have definitely known the drawing defenses, but they didn't know how to get there, and they make a simple move like this last one. Right? So just keep an eye out for that. And anyway, at least hopefully you get a better understanding of these simplest. This is the simplest king and rook pawn endgames, right? There's one pawn either side, and we can see how tricky they are. And of course, I've got a file there, 220 games, which has blunders at the earlier positions of the rook endgames. So obviously I've got a fertile area of research here. Okay, a bit longer than my normal videos, and also, of course, I've been learning a lot myself as I've been going along, which has been great. But I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.